Someone carved a face into a rock 27,000 years ago in central Mexico. That doesn't sound particularly earth-shattering until you realize that according to everything we thought we knew, humans weren't supposed to be anywhere near Mexico 27,000 years ago. In fact, they weren't supposed to be in the Americas at all. So either our entire understanding of human migration is wrong, or someone's got some serious explaining to do. Stick around, because this discovery is breaking archaeology in the best possible way. Let's set the stage here. For decades, archaeologists have been teaching a neat, clean story about how humans populated the Americas. It goes like this. Around 13,000 years ago, maybe 15,000 if we're being generous, people walked across a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska. This was during the last ice age when sea levels were lower, and there was this exposed strip of land called Beringia connecting Asia to North America. These people, called the Clovis culture after the distinctive spear points they made, spread south through an ice-free corridor and populated both continents within a few thousand years. Done. Simple, textbook material. Except it's probably wrong. And we've known it's probably wrong for a while now, but nobody wanted to admit it because the evidence kept being just ambiguous enough to argue about. Some sites suggested earlier dates. Some showed human presence before the ice-free corridor even existed. But there were always questions. Maybe the dating was off. Maybe those weren't really human artifacts. Maybe natural processes created those marks that looked like tool use. The Mexico discovery doesn't have that ambiguity problem. Not a maybe possibly could be scratch mark. A face, with eyes, a nose, a mouth, deliberate, artistic, unmistakably human in origin. And it's dated to 27,000 years ago using multiple independent methods that all agree. This isn't a mistake. This isn't contamination. This is real. The site is in Hidalgo State, central Mexico, about 60 miles northeast of Mexico City. It's a rock shelter, basically a natural overhang in limestone cliffs that would have provided protection from the elements. Humans love rock shelters. They're naturally defensible, they keep you dry, and they're way easier than building something from scratch. Archaeological sites in rock shelters exist on every continent where humans have lived. This particular rock shelter was known to locals for years, but nobody thought much of it. Some old carvings, probably a few hundred years old, maybe indigenous people from before Spanish contact. Interesting, but not groundbreaking. Then in early 2024, a team from UNAM, that's the National Autonomous University of Mexico, decided to do a proper survey. They were mapping rock art sites in the region, documenting everything for preservation purposes. They found the usual stuff at first: geometric patterns, handprints, animal figures, standard fare for rock art in central Mexico. But then they noticed something different. One carving was much more weathered than the others. The rock around it showed significant erosion. The carving itself was barely visible in certain lighting. You had to know what you were looking at to see it at all. The team brought in specialists in rock art analysis, basically taking hundreds of photos from different angles and combining them into a 3D model. When they processed the data and enhanced the images, the face emerged clearly. It's about 8 inches across, carved in profile, showing the left side of a face. The eye is an oval depression. The nose is a raised ridge. The mouth is a curved line. It's crude by modern standards, but it's absolutely intentional. Now, finding old rock art isn't unusual. Finding really old rock art isn't even that unusual. Europe has cave paintings from 40,000 years ago. Indonesia has hand stencils from similar dates. What makes this different is the location. Central Mexico, in the Americas, where humans supposedly didn't exist 27,000 years ago. The dating is where this gets interesting and complicated. You can't radiocarbon date rock. Carbon dating works on organic material, stuff that was once alive. Rock has been rock for millions of years. So how do you date a carving? You date the context around it. The research team used 3 methods. First, they analyzed the weathering patterns on the carving compared to other dated features in the shelter. Rock weathers at predictable rates depending on the type of rock and the local climate. By comparing the erosion on this carving to other features with known ages, they could estimate how long it had been exposed. Second, they looked at the sediment layers in the shelter. Archaeological sites build up over time. People live there, they leave trash, dust settles, More people live there. More layers accumulate. It's like a layer cake of human occupation. The team dug carefully, documenting each layer. They found stone tools and charcoal from ancient fires in multiple layers. The charcoal can be radiocarbon dated. The deepest layers, the ones right at the level where the carving would have been made, dated to between 26,000 and 28,000 years ago. Third, and this is the clever part, they used optically stimulated luminescence dating on sediment that had accumulated in the carved grooves themselves. OSL dating measures when sediment was last exposed to sunlight. Sediment grains store energy from cosmic radiation. When exposed to light, that energy is released. When buried in darkness, it accumulates again. By measuring how much energy is stored, you can calculate how long the sediment has been in darkness. The sediment in the carving grooves had been buried for approximately 27,000 years. 3 different dating methods, all pointing to the same time period. That's not a coincidence. That's confirmation. When the team published their preliminary findings in late 2025, the archaeological community responded with the academic equivalent of flipping tables. Not because the methodology was bad. The methodology is solid. The dating is reliable. The problem is what it means if it's true. If humans were in central Mexico 27,000 years ago, the entire timeline of human migration to the Americas needs to be rewritten. Let's walk through why this is such a big deal. The Ice Age that peaked around 20,000 years ago locked up massive amounts of water and glaciers, so much water that sea levels dropped by almost 400 feet. This exposed the Bering Land Bridge, and also made coastal routes along the Pacific difficult or impossible to navigate. The ice sheets covering Canada were massive. We're talking ice 2 miles thick in some places, covering most of Canada and extending down into what's now the northern United States. The traditional model says people crossed Beringia around 15,000 to 13,000 years ago, when an ice-free corridor opened up between 2 major ice sheets. They walked south through this corridor, entered the ice-free regions of what's now the United States, and spread from there, fast. Archaeological sites show rapid expansion. People reach South America within a couple thousand years. But if humans were in Mexico at 27,000 years ago, that corridor didn't exist yet. The ice sheets were still growing. So how did they get there? And none of them fit the neat textbook narrative. Possibility 1 is that they came earlier, before the ice sheets got too large. Maybe 30,000 or 35,000 years ago. They crossed Beringia when it was exposed, made it through the corridor before it closed up, and then survived in the Americas through the worst of the Ice Age. That's a bold claim because it means humans survived in the Americas during the glacial maximum, when conditions were absolutely brutal, cold, dry, limited resources. But hey, humans are adaptable. We've survived in some pretty harsh environments. Possibility 2 is the coastal route theory. Maybe they came down the Pacific coast in boats, hopping from beach to beach, living off marine resources. The problem is that the coastline from 27,000 years ago is now underwater. Sea level rise after the Ice Age flooded all the areas where these people would have lived. Any evidence of coastal migration is currently sitting under 400 feet of ocean. Hard to find archaeological sites when they're on the continental shelf. Possibility 3, and this is the wildest one, is that humans were in the Americas much earlier than anyone thought and we just haven't found the evidence yet. Maybe they came 40,000 or 50,000 years ago. Maybe there were multiple waves of migration. Maybe the story is way more complex than we ever imagined. The Mexico discovery isn't alone anymore. That's what's fascinating. For years, it was easy to dismiss outlier sites. One weird date, probably contamination. One site that doesn't fit, maybe the archaeologists made a mistake. But now there are multiple sites across the Americas showing earlier dates than the Clovis model allows. There's white sands in New Mexico, footprints preserved in ancient lake bed sediments, dated to around 23,000 years ago. Human footprints, adults, children, even one set that might be a teenager carrying a toddler. They walked across wet mud. The footprints hardened, sediment buried them, and they stayed preserved for 23,000 years. The dating on those is solid. Multiple labs confirmed it. People were in New Mexico 23,000 years ago. There's Chiqui White Cave, also in Mexico, about 800 miles north of the new rock art site. Stone tools dated to 30,000 years ago. maybe older. The tools are crude, not like the sophisticated Clovis points, but they're definitely tools. Humans made them. The dating has been controversial because it's pushing the boundaries of radiocarbon dating, but multiple studies have supported the original findings. There's Monte Verde in Chile. This one's been known since the 1970s, and it broke the Clovis paradigm back then. Solid evidence of human occupation 14,500 years ago. Not controversial anymore. Everyone accepts Monte Verde, but there are deeper, older layers at Monte Verde that might be 18,000 or even 33,000 years old. Those dates are still debated, but they're looking more plausible as other early sites are confirmed, dated to 24,000 years ago. The problem is distinguishing human-made cut marks from natural processes or carnivore tooth marks. The debate continues, but the evidence is stronger than it used to be. All these sites together paint a picture. Humans might have been in the Americas a lot earlier than we thought. Not just a little earlier. A lot earlier, like twice as long ago as the Clovis model suggests. So what does the rock carving add to this? It adds art. It adds culture. It adds sophistication. Stone tools are practical. Humans made tools because they needed to cut things, scrape things, hunt things. Tools don't necessarily indicate complex thought. I mean, they do indicate some level of cognitive ability. Art is symbolic thinking. Art is communication. Art is culture. You don't carve a face into a rock because you need to. You do it because you want to. Because it means something. Because you're expressing something. The Mexico face tells us that 27,000 years ago, humans in the Americas weren't just surviving. They were creating. They had the time and the cognitive capacity for artistic expression. This matches what we know about human cognitive evolution. By 27,000 years ago, humans were fully modern in every way. Cave paintings in Europe, carved figurines, musical instruments, complex tools, symbolic behavior. There's no reason humans in the Americas wouldn't have had the same capabilities. The question was never whether they could make art. The question was whether they were even there to make it. The face carving also suggests something else. Permanence. Rock art is meant to last. It's not like painting on a hide that deteriorates in a few years or making a temporary camp and moving on. Carving rock takes effort, time, intention. It suggests people were using this rock shelter repeatedly. Maybe seasonally, maybe for generations. It was important enough to mark. Important enough to leave a sign that said we were here. Let's talk about what life might have been like for these people. We're in the last ice age, but we're not at the peak yet. That doesn't come for another 7,000 years. Central Mexico at 27,000 years ago would have been cooler than today, drier, but still habitable. There would have been grasslands, some forests, rivers and lakes, plenty of game animals, mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths. Ice Age North America was wild. These people were hunter-gatherers. They moved with the seasons, following animal migrations, exploiting plant resources as they became available. They probably lived in small groups, extended families or bands of 20 to 50 people. They had sophisticated knowledge of their environment. They had to. Survival depended on knowing where to find water, which plants were edible, where animals congregated, when to move to new areas. They had tools, stone tools mostly, because stone survives. Bone, hide, fiber, things that don't survive in the archaeological record. We find the stone tools because stone lasts. But stone tools were probably a minority of their total toolkit. They had language. Humans 27,000 years ago were anatomically and cognitively modern. They had the same vocal apparatus we do, the same brain structure. They communicated with complex language. They told stories. They passed down knowledge. They had names for things and concepts. They argued, joked, taught their children. They had social structures, rules about who could mate with whom. We know this from other sites. Skeletons showing healed injuries that would have required care to survive. Elderly individuals who lived years past when they could hunt or gather effectively, meaning someone was feeding them. And they had art. That face carved in the rock proves it. Art means they had the cognitive capacity for symbolic thinking. They could represent something concrete with something abstract. A carving represents a face. That's a cognitive leap that separates humans from every other species. The implications of all this are enormous. If the traditional Clovis model is wrong, and all the evidence suggests it is, then we need to reconsider how humans populated the planet. The Americas weren't the last place humans reached. They might have been reached much earlier than we thought, which changes our understanding of human migration patterns, adaptability, and cultural development. It also raises questions about why we were so wedded to the Clovis model for so long. Part of it is how science works. You build a model based on the best available evidence. The Clovis sites were well documented, clearly human, easy to date. They fit a narrative. People crossed Beringia, spread south, end of story. When new evidence contradicts the model, there's resistance. Maybe the new evidence is wrong. Maybe the dating is off. Maybe there's another explanation. When enough evidence accumulates, the model has to change. That's where we are now. The Clovis first model is dead. Not everyone has admitted it yet, but it's dead. Too many sites, too many dates, too much evidence that doesn't fit. The new model is messier. Multiple migrations maybe, coastal routes and inland routes. Earlier dates that keep pushing back. It's not as clean, not as simple, but it's more accurate. The Mexico rock carving is part of that evidence pile. It's not the only piece, but it's an important one. It's visual. It's unambiguous. It's dated reliably. And it forces us to accept that humans in the Americas 27,000 years ago weren't struggling to survive in marginal environments. They were established enough to create art. There's still so much we don't know. We don't know how many people were in the Americas at this time. Could have been a few hundred, could have been thousands. We don't know if these early populations were ancestors of later Native American groups or if they died out and were replaced. Genetic studies are trying to answer that. But it's complicated. DNA degrades over time. We have very few ancient remains from this period in the Americas. We don't know the full extent of their range. Were they throughout the Americas or confined to certain regions? Did they reach South America yet? The Monte Verde evidence suggests maybe yes, but that's still debated. Were they on the east coast of North America? No evidence yet, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The eastern seaboard from 27,000 years ago is also underwater now. We don't know what happened to them during the glacial maximum, that period around 20,000 years ago when conditions were at their worst. Did they survive in refugia, pockets of habitable land surrounded by ice and tundra? Did populations crash and barely hang on? Did some groups die out entirely? We don't know. What we do know is that by 15,000 years ago, archaeological sites become common. Technologies become more sophisticated. The Clovis points are beautifully made, way more refined than the crude tools from earlier sites. Maybe the existing populations just had more resources and could support larger groups. The research continues. The team in Mexico is still excavating the rock shelter. They're looking for more evidence, more artifacts, anything that can tell us more about the people who made that carving. They're using ground-penetrating radar to see if there are other features buried under sediment. They're analyzing pollen samples to reconstruct the ancient environment. They're looking at tool-making debris to understand what technologies these people had. Other teams are surveying the surrounding area. If people were using this rock shelter, they were probably using other sites nearby. Maybe there are more carvings. Maybe there are living sites, places where they camped and left behind hearths and tools. Finding a cluster of sites from the same time period would tell us so much more about how these people lived. The genetics work is crucial too. If researchers can extract ancient DNA from remains in the Americas older than 15,000 years, they can trace lineages, see how these early populations relate to later Native American groups. But finding ancient remains is hard, and finding ones that preserve DNA is even harder. The Americas don't have the cold, dry caves that preserve Neanderthal DNA so well in Europe. There's also the question of underwater archaeology. If the coastal migration theory is right, the evidence is sitting on the continental shelf. Underwater archaeology is expensive and difficult, but it's getting better. We have ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, that can survey the seafloor. We have better sonar technology. Maybe in the next decade we'll start finding those submerged coastal sites and finally prove that theory. The Mexico discovery is a reminder that we don't know everything. We think we do. We build models and write textbooks and teach students. But then someone finds a carved face in a rock, and the whole thing falls apart. That's not a failure of science. That's science working exactly as it should. New evidence forces us to revise our understanding, especially for people who built careers on the old model, but it's necessary. For the rest of us, it's exciting. Every new discovery adds a piece to the puzzle. We're learning about who we are as a species, how we spread across the planet, how we adapted to new environments. The story is more complex than we thought, and that makes it more interesting. 27,000 years ago, someone stood in that rock shelter in central Mexico and carved a face into the stone. We don't know why. We don't know who they were, but we know they were there. And that changes everything. Thanks for watching. More archaeology deep dives coming soon. Hit subscribe if you want to see them.